There are few positions within the United States government that I feel are as powerful as that of the United States Secretary of State. Now, each of the other executive parts, basically those members of the cabinet, have some sort of check either within the executive branch itself that limits their power directly, or indirectly is limited through the checks and balances of the three branches of the government. A perfect example is the Attorney General. If what the Attorney General says and believes is not supported by the district courts and is not at the end supported by the Supreme Court, it's all for naught. Similarly, you can have the Secretary of the Treasury, who needs to be supported by the Federal Reserve Bank to actually get the funds needed or to help implement change, or Congress, once again, through the power of the purse, which would be limiting what the Secretary of the Treasury can do. Now, in both of these examples, the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Treasury, there's limits that are restraining how much power they have. So then, when you're looking at the most powerful person within the executive branch that's not the president, in my opinion, the answer becomes clear. It's the Secretary of the State. Now, they have a direct line to the president. Everyone in the cabinet does, but this is unique because it's one of the first people in the line of succession and one of the most people overall within the executive branch. Obviously, they're going to be looking over the foreign policy, which is one of the most important parts of what the president is going to do. How are you going to deal with other nations? What countries are you going to invade? What countries are you going to give aid to? How are you going to work with this leader or that leader? That's what the Secretary of State is talking about, and that's what the Secretary of State influences. And once again, they have a direct line to the presidency, so they can influence the thoughts of the leader of the free world, of the leader of the most powerful nation in the world. They also have access to the public and news. Everyone knows who the Secretary of State is. Because of that, if the Secretary of State says something or does something, everyone is going to know about it. So just by saying something or thinking something, they're able to implement change by influencing public opinion. They're also the policymakers. Once again, they're telling the president how to act with other countries. So overall, they have some of the most expansive powers and a most expansive influence. Now, I wanted to make this episode, this series, which I'm going to be calling the State Acting Secretary, because so much of history is focused on the branch's main figurehead, which is the president, while it ignores the actions of some of the most influential cabinet members. And as said, that includes, if not instantly brings to mind, the position of Secretary of State. Now, few names are capable of bringing about thoughts of respect, reverence, fear, ignominy as previous Secretaries of State. You have some of the big names, Thomas Jefferson, Robert McNamara, Hillary Clinton, and John Quincy Adams. All of these people who have historically been Secretary of State, and even if they've been something else, it's due to their experience as Secretary of State. They've been able to build a reputation from just holding that position. Now, there's one name that in the modern day stands out as not only having such a polarizing, diametric public opinion, but also stands out for continuing to influence politics for decades after leaving the position of Secretary of State, and that is that of Henry Kissinger. So in this first episode of The State After the Secretary, I want to be focusing on Henry Kissinger, who served as the National Security Advisor to the President from 1969 to 1975, and then served as Secretary of State from 1973 to 1977. So there's this big expanse of time, like just about 8 years, 1969 to 1977, where he's influencing the executive branch and telling the president, who's Nixon for most of it, how to deal with politics. Now, I will be referring to parts of the trial of Henry Kissinger by Christopher Hitchens. Now, just because I feel like Christopher Hitchens has a really great way of dealing with controversial topics. Now, one of my most well-done university speeches I've ever listened to was Axis of Evil, where he revisits Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, and he gives a depressingly beautiful summation of life in those nations. It's succinct, it's accurate, and it shows how he has thought of those countries, and it gives a microcosm of life overall. Now, once again, he has a great mind for looking at something with the facts. He does not hold back at all with his opinion, and the trial of Henry Kissinger itself is written in a way that a court case might be presented before the prosecution or by the prosecution. So, it's a perfect parcel of information to be able to look at when analyzing such a unique tenure in the government. So I will be linking that down below as well as all my other sources just so you guys can look at exactly what I saw while making this episode. Now, I'm going to be looking at the foreign policy of 3 specific areas where Henry Kissinger was involved. Those would be Indochina, Bangladesh, and Chile. And then I'm going to be concluding with his overall, what some could say is magnum opus of foreign policy, which is that of China. So without further ado, I'm going to be starting off with Indochina. Now, I'm going to be basically just looking at quotes of the trial of Henry Kissinger and then analyzing it and saying how this affects his tenure overall as Secretary of State. Now, the first part is regarding his bombing of Indochina, specifically the countries of Cambodia and Laos. Now, during the Vietnam War, these countries were neutral. As he says, quote, "Of nothing is this more truth," quote, referring to things of brutality, destruction, needless destruction, quote, "than his own individual involvement in the bombing and invasion of neutral Cambodia and Laos. Obsessed with the idea that Vietnamese intersignance could be traced to allies or resources external to Vietnam itself, or could be overcome by tactics of mass destruction, Kissinger at one point contemplated using thermonuclear weapons to obliterate the path through which ran the railway from North Vietnam to China, and at another stage considered bombing the dikes that prevented North Vietnam's irrigation system from flooding the country." Quote. So once again, overall, this is against everything that I believe the United States should stand for. What you're doing is attacking thousands and you're damaging the lives of millions. And this is stuff that's continuing on to this day. The bombs are still on the ground. Some of these are unexploded ordnance. Some of these are chemical weapons that have completely damaged any crops that could potentially grow there, so they just can't grow anything there anymore. So what Henry Kissinger basically did was destroy an entire region. And there wasn't, of course there was some sort of military reason for this, and that's because people were transporting things through Cambodia and Laos to aid the North during the Vietnam War. However, I don't really think you could justify everything that he did, once again, contemplating using thermonuclear weapons, because of that war. I'm going to be getting into this in a little bit, but there's an idea of ethics. So you can't use realpolitik for everything. You need to be able to show some respect for a country and show some respect for what it's doing. He goes on to say that, quote, "The U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Refugees estimated that in the same four-year period, 1968 to 1972, quote, just so you guys remember, he took place in the NSA, or as the National Security Advisor in 1969, quote, rather more than 3 million civilians were killed, injured, or rendered homeless. In the same four-year period, the United States dropped almost 4,500,000 tons of high explosives on Indochina," quote. So this is not unprecedented. The United States has attacked neutral countries or declared or undeclared countries in self-defense, or perhaps with another good reason. But the sheer scale of the damage is what is unprecedented and what should be scrutinized. Once again, this is affecting people to this day. Kissinger's effect is still felt by those who live in Indochina, specifically as elucidated in Cambodia and Laos. These people are still feeling what Henry Kissinger did, and there's no good reason for that. We could have won the Vietnam War. Well, in the end, really, we didn't win the Vietnam War, did we? So what he did was the needless death, the needless destruction of lives in Indochina. So that covers that section. I'll now be moving on to Bangladesh. Now, this is the main thesis that I really want to go off of. This is what I'm going to be calling the anti-Kissinger rule. So if you pass this rule, you're doing exactly what Henry Kissinger would not have done. And this is the rule. Those democratically and fairly elected in a stable and peaceful democracy should not be disposed of unless they show an active and aggressive threat to their own people or to neighboring populations or countries. So it's basically saying, unless you're threatening people within your country, and unless you're threatening people outside of your country, if you meet the requirement of being democratically and fairly elected, you should not be deposed of and you should not be actively acted against. This basically means do not use realpolitik with people who have been fairly elected. Do not treat them with brutality. Treat them with fairness. Even if you disagree with them, find a way to open up diplomatic means with them and be able to have a peaceful dialogue. That's that's the antithesis to realpolitik. Henry Kissinger, what he was doing was going against everything that stood for, as you can see with Bangladesh. Now, he was supporting Pakistan during a time when it was committing genocide within Bangladesh. Quote, "Having readied the ambush, Pakistani regular soldiers set fire to the women's dormitory at the university and then mowed the occupants down with machine guns as they sought to escape. The guns, along with all other weaponry, had been furnished under United States military assistance programs." Quote. So once again, he allowed for the genocide to occur without doing anything about it. And moreover, he had been actually giving the weapons with which the genocide was committed. So he has blood on his hands if you look at Bangladesh alone. Now, Christopher Hitchens goes on to say, quote, We now know of one reason why the general was so favored, quote, regarding people that would be overthrowing the democratically elected president who should have been put in power, quote, um, at a time when he had made himself and his patrons responsible for the grossest war crimes and crimes against humanity. In April 1971, a United States ping pong team had accepted a surprise invitation to compete in Beijing. By the end of that month, using the Pakistani ambassador as an intermediary, the Chinese authorities had forwarded a letter inviting Nixon to send an envoy. And thus there was one motive of realpolitik for the shame that Nixon and Kissinger were to visit on their own country for its complicity in the extermination of the Bengalis, quote. So here's the real thing. You had an elected in Pakistan, which at this time still had West Pakistan, East Pakistan, so what we currently know as Pakistan, and Bangladesh. It had elected a Bengali in one of its first elections, 1970. But the president, who was supposed to be giving up power, the incumbent, he was not surrendering his power, and he actually said he's going to postpone when the legislature can be overall. So instead of acting in favor of putting the Bengali president into power, what Henry Kissinger was actually doing was actively going against this. He promoted Pakistan. He said that it was fine, and on top of all of that, he was actually using it to his own advantage to be able to open up relations with China. Now, I'm going to be getting into opening up relations with China, but you can see he's going against the main idea that I was going at. Those democratically and fairly elected and a stable and peaceful democracy should not be deposed. He showed no threat. Once again, Bengalis were a minority within Pakistan at this time, so they had no threat to the overall population, and he's fairly and democratically elected. There should have been no controversy, except that Henry Kissinger allowed for Pakistan to devolve into genocide, and he allowed for Pakistan to remain a military dictatorship. Now, there's one other quote. It says, quote, in November 1974, on a brief face-saving tour of the region, Kissinger made an 8-hour stop in Bangladesh and gave a 3-minute press conference in which he refused to say why he had sent the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal 3 years before. Within a few weeks of his departure, we now know, a faction at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka began covertly meeting with a group of Bangladeshi officers who were planning a coup against Mujib. Quote, he was the leader of Bangladesh at the time. Quote, on 14th August 1974, Mujib and 40 members of her family were murdered in a military takeover. His closest former political associates were bayoneted to death in their prison cells a few months after that. Quote. So once again, here we have Henry Kissinger, who's allowing for this coup to occur. He actually aided the coup. He's not being held responsible. We should be holding Henry Kissinger responsible for what he did. Now, once again, he's benefited the United States in numerous other ways, which I will be getting into mainly with China. But this is just a micro. Once again, this is just showing how brutal he's been with a country like Bangladesh. He's showing very little remorse, and he's doing it to actively progress his own thoughts and his own opinions of what should be done in the region. Now, there should be no show of thankfulness to Saudi Arabia with the Pakistanis during this time of genocide and blatant disregard for democratic principles. Overthrowing leaders because one does not agree with them is not how stability lasts, or is created, or is endured. What it actually did was result in a lack of stability, and Bangladesh devolved into the military dictatorship, as you guys heard. There's a coup. Kissinger promoted that coup, and that was because he was not supporting democratic principles. And this is just as Pakistan has constantly done. You don't support democratic leaders in Pakistan, what's going to happen is that you're not going to have democracy in Pakistan. You're not going to support democratic leaders in Bangladesh. Guess what? You're not going to have a stable democracy in Bangladesh. Now, in this last section, which I'm going to be taking from the trial of Henry Kissinger, I'm going to be looking at Chile. And I think just getting right into it with a quote is the best way. Quote, in a famous expression of his contempt for democracy, Kissinger once observed that he saw no reason why a certain country should be allowed to, quote, go Marxist, quote, merely because, quote, its people are irresponsible, quote. The country concerned was Chile, which at the time of his remark had a justified reputation of the most highly evolved pluralistic democracy in the southern hemisphere of the Americas, quote. So Chile has 3 parties at this time. You had a conservative party, communist, a leftist party, and then you had a centrist party. And this was, each roughly had a third, so it's a perfect setup. Usually in countries like the United States, you won't have a third party. You'll just have a devolution into 2 parties. Or you'll have a situation like the UK, where you'll have too many parties that breeds, radical thoughts. So to be able to form a coalition government, you have a relatively moderate, slightly left, slightly right government. They'll have to veer even farther to the right, farther to the left, just to be able to get a majority within Parliament or Congress or whatever you actually have. You've had examples of this, where to get a majority, you had possibilities of having to join with UKIP. You've had this happen in the Bundestag. So Chile has an actual stable three-party system, and we should be supporting this because, once again, those democratically and fairly elected in a stable democracy should not be deposed of unless they are a threat to the people or people outside their country. So even if the country is going Marxist, if the country can sustain itself, not collapse, and not threaten or threaten the collapse of its neighbors in the region, then the country should be left alone. You should not be involved with it. Now, quote, declassified documents show that Kissinger, who had previously neither known nor cared about Chile, described it offhandedly as a, quote, a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica, quote, took seriously this chance to impress his boss. A group was set up in Langley, Virginia, with the express purpose of running a, quote, two-track, quote, policy for Chile, one of the ostensible diplomatic one, and the other, unknown to the State Department or the U.S. ambassador to Chile, Edward Corey, a strategy of destabilization, kidnap, and assassination designated to provoke a military coup. Quote. So here you go. Once again, he is not even informing the State Department. This is, once again, I started off by saying how powerful the Secretary of State is. They can take action in, or people like Henry Kissinger are. He can take action without even having it influenced by the State Department or the U.S. Ambassador to Chile. He's going rogue, and he's able to do it just because of how much influence he has. Now, not only was Kissinger practicing egregious and pragmatic abuses of power, but he was trying to do it to ensure he benefited by impressing Richard Nixon. The nature of the country, as elucidated, was one which would promptly and, here's the key, democratically return a little to the right and be centrist, or even farther to the right and be conservative, without the entire government coming to a grind. There's no reason to supposedly return democracy, since what was happening was exactly what was to be expected in a democracy. Chile was functioning. In a three-party system, you're going to have, let's say, the conservatives win, people like them, then they get disillusioned, they move to the center, they don't really like that, they've had a sour taste of the right, they're going to move to the left. That's how it goes. Democracy is a pendulum, it goes from left to right to left. You don't stop time on the grandfather clock because you don't like what it's showing, and that's exactly what he did. He thought that, oh, Chile is going rogue. We can't let this happen. It's, as he said, quote, going Marxist, quote. And because of that, he found it justified to be able to attack or overthrow the leaders of the country. This is not something that we should be promoting. This is an aspect of realpolitik that is simply not sustainable, because if you think that destabilizing countries and putting in your own supporters is fine, what you're going to have is a backlash within that country. You're going to have people not support what you're doing, and they're going to go against you. You had the same thing happen in Iran. You had the same thing happen in Iraq, which eventually culminated in the Civil War. And I mentioned Iran, when you were putting in the Shah, they went against us because they didn't like him. This type of foreign policy is not sustainable, and it's not something that we should be actively promoting at all. Now, I want to get into one more quote about Chile, and it says, quote, more significantly, Kissinger advocated that, quote, close relations, quote, be maintained with military leaders in neighboring countries in order to facilitate both the coordination of pressure against Chile and the incubation of opposition within the country. And outlined this prefigures the disclosures that had since been made about Operation Candor, a secret collusion between military dictatorships across the hemisphere operated with the United States' known knowledge and indulgence, quote. So what Henry Kissinger here is doing is trying to destroy yet another democracy and yet another country for yet another selfish goal, and results in the collapse of the country in 1973 and 1974. Kissinger loved to play politics, but only when it benefited him. What politics should be is about benefiting as many as possible at the expense of as few as possible. After all, it's a moral hazard to try and entertain the thought that realpolitik should yet again have been employed. It emboldened one to look at past war crimes and disregard for law and order in search of the supposed best possible result. You cannot think that realpolitik is the only way to deal with anything, because if you think that, you're going to not have, you're not going to entertain the possibility that it could have been done another way. So there we go. Now, the best consistent result is letting democracy grind its gears, sometimes grinding, sometimes struggling, but always continuing. That's what Chile would have done. Once again, they would have returned to the right. If that's what Henry Kissinger wanted, fine. You have a three-party system, it was going to happen. But he wanted to tinker and see what he could do to make sure it benefited him as positively as possible. And that's what resulted in a collapse in Chile and a return of military dictatorship. So these are three countries that I covered: three regions: Indochina, Bangladesh, and Chile. And all of those would, as you would say, have a very poor state after the secretary. So after Henry Kissinger dealt with them, you would say that, oh, they were a horrible mess afterwards. But there's one thing that you should look at, and that's China. That China, as I said, is definitely the crown jewel of anything that Henry Kissinger might have done, just because China is one of the most important countries on the world stage right now, and Henry Kissinger normalized our relations with them, which is immensely important. This is one of the first main, large communist countries that we're finally opening communications with, and this is in large part due to Henry Kissinger. Now, I found one political article which I thought was extremely interesting because it gave different historians' opinions on Henry Kissinger, and it was just as varied as there were as many historians. So every historian had a different opinion. So I'm going to be looking at a couple of those. The first one, and these are just excerpts of their opinion. Each opinion was about a paragraph, paragraph and a half. This is just excerpts of that, like one or two sentence excerpts. So first you have Nicholas Thompson, who's the editor of NewYorker.com, and he says, quote, "His China policy was one of America's great Cold War achievements. He deserves to be honored and to be given a medal, but one with the image of a man who is scowling and holding a knife." Quote. So there you go. That imagery instantly conveys how people think of Henry Kissinger. He was a realpolitik and an effective person when he was using it and utilizing it. But in the end, it was rather brutal. It was rather intense. So because of so since China was not democratically, I want to go back to that rule. Is China democratically and fairly elected? Not really. It lost the mandate of the people really after Mao Zedong and after the government started to become unpopular. So since China was not democratically or fairly elected, the rule does not apply. So it's fine to use realpolitik within this particular situation in furtherance of U.S. interests. You know, some aspects of it were immensely popular, other parts were not. China's government at this time had a really complicated situation. You had the Gang of Five or Gang of Four. The gang, whatever it was. Excuse me. It's a rather complex situation. So I'll give him a leeway. He can fine if he wants to further. You can use realpolitik. However, it should not have been at the cost of Bangladesh. Once again, looking at the idea of, is it threatening to neighboring countries? It damaged Bangladesh due to the communication that was needed with Pakistan, which means that in this situation, it ultimately fails the test. So I believe another method or route should have been used to get to this goal. And now, due to the nature of the situation, the quotation stands out as being extremely critical, yet oddly thankful, which is something one can only be forced to agree with. Henry Kissinger made an important change in U.S. foreign policy, which was opening communication with China. And if we had not opened up communication with China after we had defeated Russia, you'd still have another China or communist nation that we would have to quote unquote deal with. So by making sure that we weren't on negative terms with China, we were able to ease some of the tensions of the Cold War. Now, David Greenberg, who is a professor of history, journalism, and media studies at Rutgers University, he's not as thankful to Henry Kissinger as others are. He says, quote, "Nixon was the grand strategist, Kissinger the tactician," quote. So the context of the tactics means that they were morally bankrupt, but they reaped massive political benefits from the open road with China that came about. So Kissinger, as David Greenberg would say, may have been given too much credit, but he still deserves credit at the least. Henry Kissinger, he was the one that was actually using realpolitik. Nixon wanted to open up trade and open up communication with China, and it was Henry Kissinger who had the clout and the understanding to look at how it could be done. He used this, as he's been mentioning over and over again, using brutal, intense, some would say unnecessary realpolitik, but in the end effective realpolitik. He was able to get the end goal and further U.S. interests, which were at the time to get communications with China. After all, there's a quote that goes something like, "Only Nixon could have traveled to China," or "obviously it could only be Tricky Dick." That's what Kissinger's legacy is, opening up that communication with China. So yeah, he says that Nixon was a grand strategist, sure, but a strategy but an idea, and an idea that has no way of execution, that has no tactic, is not an idea, it's a thought. There's no point of having it. It's not something grand. It's something peculiar, and it's an oddity that cannot be implemented effectively. Now I want to go on to Business Insider. Now this is current. This is current politics now. China is the most long-lasting influence that Henry Kissinger has. There's no doubt about that. So currently, there's Su Hao, who I'm going to be looking at, like I said, Business Insider. This is from 2016, so it's extremely recent. This was just after the election, just by December. Now, Su Hao, a professor at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, said Kissinger had broad connections with Chinese leadership, which Trump would use to, quote, exchange opinions, quote, with Beijing before he took office. So that's a quote from Business Insider talking about Trump's relationship with China, which was being established by Henry Kissinger. So even before Donald Trump got into office, the foreign policy of one of the most unique presidents in United States history was being set by who? Henry Kissinger. No one else. Or it could have been no one else. Now, we still do not know to the extent to which Henry Kissinger is shaping relations with China, but we have a really good idea. One thing, no matter what though, is certain. He stabilized, standardized, and immunized from threat the diplomacy between the two countries, meaning that someone like Trump could not simply undo the relationship in its entirety. Trump can't just undo the connection we have with China, because Henry Kissinger created a stalwart foundation during the Cold War, and other people have used his advice to see how they could build upon it and not detract from it. Now, China is one of the most important countries that are currently at play globally, and since they are not a democracy, once again, Kissinger diplomacy works extraordinarily well. He's able to put us at least on mutually respectable terms and will be needed to resolve any crisis that might come about. So Henry Kissinger, once again, I do not agree with the methodology, but I do support the end result of what came about. So there's this idea. Do the end support the means? This is up to everyone's own opinion. I personally think, once again, depending on the country, if the country is democratically and fairly elected, then no. If the country is not, have at it, Hoss. Now, one final quote. One final quote. This one is from Forbes.com. This is regarding Trump's trip to Asia. So, quote, patience is also key in negotiating with Chinese partners, since they usually do not present the best options until a series of back-and-forth discussion has ensued. Henry Kissinger has written, quote, American diplomacy pursues specific outcomes with single-minded determination. Chinese negotiators are more likely to view the process as combining political, economic, and strategic elements and to seek outcomes with an extended process, quote, quote. So, once again, even now, people have to mention Henry Kissinger when you're mentioning China and foreign policy, because the most enduring aspect of Kissinger's diplomacy and persona was his ability to ignore people and humanity and pursue, with absolute resoluteness and purpose, the ultimate diplomatic or political goal which he was after, regardless of the nation. And in this specific situation, that nation is China. Now, nations, for him, devolved into pawns that, like pieces on a chessboard, eventually became the first part of a plan for victory, with the grander parts to follow. And there was Bangladesh, there was Pakistan, there's Indochina. He had to get those out of the way to pursue his ultimate goal. And what was that ultimate goal? That was a relationship with China. He succeeded, and so with that, the United States benefited. So my final thoughts on Henry Kissinger is that the only way to look at Kissinger is to understand that realpolitik has its necessity in certain ways, but only small parts within grand plans. It's like the death penalty. It is necessary to do the dirty work, but should only be done when there's an absolute certainty with what is being done is either fair or will result in a positive outcome. If you follow my anti-Kissingerian rule, if the government is fairly and democratically elected, it should not be deposed of unless it opposes a threat to another country, then it will basically steer you the right way. Now, Kissinger created the current U.S. version of realpolitik politics, which politicians and pundits and all the others seeking for advice still look for. But the one caveat is that he uses only a preponderance of evidence rather than going beyond a shadow of a doubt to see when it is necessary. He thinks, we might be able to get some benefit, use realpolitik. There's a possibility, use realpolitik. That's his major flaw, that's his Achilles heel, but overall it was still rather effective just because he still retained enough insight, enough clout to see when it was indeed necessary. Now, Kissinger fought for America, but he was also undoubtedly selfish. But oddly enough, that might have been a bad thing for the United States Secretary of State to do. He opens up an entire new issue of what the United States should stand for, and if the United States has a moral obligation to do something in times of crisis, like in Bangladesh, or to potentially let crises develop in order to provide the support for morality and democracy. Basically what that means is, if Kissinger is supporting an ultimate end goal of stability, and he's able to reap the rewards of that, should he be supported? Now, that's the question I'm posing to you guys. I believe I've made my opinion on that explicitly clear. Now, he was, to wit, the harbinger of brutality and diplomacy. He was the bringer of peace and of war. And depending on which country one was in, Kissinger brought either the best of times or the worst of times. Now, you cannot define what he has done now because it was during the fight to make America the most important country. This was during the Cold War. That's where Kissinger is. And once again, I want to bring you back to that date I started this off with. When was he in power? The late 60s and the early to mid-late 70s. This is Kissinger's time period. That's where he was dominating. And this is a period where the ultimate end of the Cold War, which would now end for another like 13 years, it was not certain. We did not know that the United States was ultimately going to come out on top because we didn't know how politics was going to play out. So what Kissinger was doing, however brutal, however pragmatic it might have been, was to make sure that the United States ended up on top. Did he succeed? Yes. But my question to you guys is, at what cost? If Henry Kissinger is what it took to make the United States the greatest country in the world, do we deserve to be the greatest country in the world? And so that's my opinion of Henry Kissinger, and that is the first episode of The State After the Secretary. I want to thank you guys for watching, or listening, I should say, and I'll include all pertinent information and links in the description below. Once again, thank you very much, and stay tuned.